We must start from the simple premise that Africa's future is up to Africans.
Barack Obama was embraced as the son of a Kenyan and the first African-American president. Nearly 8 years later, we'll look at the U.S. president's legacy in Africa. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. When Barack Obama was elected President of the United States in 2008, his victory was celebrated across Africa. With his personal connection to Kenya, many on the continent considered him one of their own. During his administration, Mr. Obama made 4 trips to sub-Saharan Africa, visiting 6 countries. He emphasized trade instead of aid, launching 2 programs, the Young African Leaders Initiative and Power Africa. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Angelo Coppola in Johannesburg. And Angelo, President Obama addressed students at the University of Cape Town in South Africa during a visit in 2013. He spoke about Nelson Mandela and how one man's courage can change the world. What do you believe will be Obama's legacy in South Africa?
Well, Anand, according to a presidential watcher here in South Africa, Obama exemplifies integrity, honesty, transparency. He's a good family man, essentially all a positive example to the world and specifically to South Africans. And he was also very strong on bilateral negotiations, and his administration always thought that South Africa punched below its weight. The Obama administration, I'm told, always made the point that Africa was seen as a US, China, Africa triple win opportunity. Practically, one impact point that Obama did succeed in doing was the renewal of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. You'll remember that when South Africa dragged its heels on certain aspects, like on poultry imports, Obama, via his trade representative, forced the issue and brought the deal back on track. Then there's Power Africa, as you've mentioned, an Obama initiative aimed at, in fact, doubling access to energy for Africans. It's exceeded its initial targets, and the roadmap to 2030 now is codified in US law, which means that the president-elect will find it difficult to rescind it if he were to do that. And while it will have a limited impact on South Africa, it's a good starting point for the continent because it's going to mean the crowding in of funding. Anand?
Now, Angela, as we are all aware, South Africa is facing the largest HIV epidemic in the world, with an estimated 7 million people living with the virus. US President George W. Bush created the government initiative, the US government initiative called the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Was that program supported by the Obama administration when this president came to power?
Well, initially, you'll recall that the Obama administration slashed the funding to PEPFAR. That surprised many, and there was a lot of criticism around it. But I've been told that Obama is an evidence-based decision maker, and over the years, funding has been increased. In fact, there's a fact sheet that was released by the White House in July of this year, in fact, that suggests that the administration is back on track to meet its new target of some 12.9 million people on treatment by 2017. And they're also hoping to reduce the new HIV infection rates among adolescent women. It's a noble objective, but if we weigh it against what's happening in South Africa in terms of infection rates, for example, here we're seeing an estimated 1,000 people who are infected with HIV every single day. So there's a long battle ahead of us. But there is a ray of hope here. Yesterday in South Africa, we heard about a new 4-year vaccine-based trial involving some 4,500 people. It's based on a successful trial in Thailand, and here's holding sums that will solve part of the scourge that we're facing in Africa. Anand?
Thanks, Angelo. That's CCTV's Angelo Coppola reporting from Johannesburg. Joining us now from Paris is Christina Okela. She's a journalist with Radio France International. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Monde Muyangwa. She's the director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and we're joined by Peter Pham. He's the Vice President of Research and Regional Initiatives and Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Christina, let's start with you in Paris. No sooner had Barack Obama been elected president than Africa claimed him to be one of their own, the son of Africa. There was a great deal of pride, as we remember. 8 years later, looking at it now, do you think Africans in Africa feel the same way?
Well, Armand, views are mixed here. On the one hand, yes, Obama still remains the uncontested superstar. The fact that the US elected their first Kenyan president still remains a big deal for many Africans on the continent. His election symbolized that, for the first time, racial prejudice was no longer a barrier. It was finally over, and anyone, no matter where he or she came from, could succeed if they tried and one day make it to the White House. So there's still that sense of pride, as you mentioned, and that enthusiasm. But on the other hand, there is also criticism. Some experts, while covering the story, have said that they really they expected more from Barack Obama being the first African president elected in the U.S. to actually help the continent tackle notably its challenges when it comes to democracy. If we recall back in 2009 when he went on his first African tour, first of all to Cairo in Egypt and then Ghana shortly afterwards, he talked about launching this new beginning between the US and the Muslim world, including some African states. But he said also that he wanted African leaders to do more to help their populations come out of poverty. He wanted African leaders to do more to tackle corruption. So there was a tremendous amount of impetus and energy.
Okay, Peter, when we look at this administration's policy on Africa, is there any signature policy initiative by President Obama by which he'll be remembered in Africa? George Bush had the PEPFAR initiative, the fight against AIDS. Is there anything similar for President Obama?
I would make the argument that President Barack Obama, perhaps his greatest contribution to Africa and U.S.-Africa relations in particular, has been helping push a change of mindset from Africa as lacking in agency, Africa as a recipient of donor aid and assistance, to Africa as an opportunity, Africa as a business partner. The U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 2014 was the largest ever gathering of African leaders convened by a U.S. president, and included as a key part of it a U.S.-Africa Business Forum. This past September in New York, President Obama convened a second U.S.-Africa Business Forum. So the emphasis on the economic, commercial relationships, I think that's going to be remembered as I think a key contribution.
But how
on the other hand,
how was that translated how was that policy implemented in Africa? Did it change the lives of Africans?
Well, I think in the long term, it's the beginning of the change of a corporate mentality, and one can't underestimate. That being said, to answer your question about signature initiatives, there isn't a signature initiative on lines of Millennium Challenge, PEPFAR, from President George W. Bush, or the signing of AGOA, even the African Growth and Opportunity Act under President Clinton, although that was extended and renewed by President Bush and President Obama. There's been a lack of that, and I think that's a serious question. Now, there are a lack of resources, there are different fiscal environment, different political environment, all those things have to be factored in. But I think it's something, one of the things that spokesmen for the administration often cite as their signature initiative, it's an important one. I don't want to belittle, I think it's a very important, is the Young African Leaders Initiative, the YALI initiative, which brings young African leaders, the next generations, to Washington. But that only impacts 1,000 people a year. And so I'm so almost embarrassing that is put up as the signature initiative.
Monday, there's been some criticism of Obama's policy or his engagement with Africa. The Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington said that he'd been insufficiently engaged in Africa and failed to make the case for its continued relevance in parts of the continent. Was Africa really a priority for this president, or was it on the back burner throughout his term?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it builds on what both Christina and Peter have talked about. I take a slightly more nuanced view of what the Obama legacy in Africa will be. First of all, I think, and I think Christina touched on this when she talked about it, we have to understand the political environment, both domestically and internationally, as well as the economic environment in which President Obama assumed office. Christina talked on about President being the first Black president with a very direct connection to the African continent. I think that raised unrealistically high expectations of the president, that he was going to put Africa front and center. However, the reality is Africa has never been in the vital interests of the United States. It was never going to be a priority in terms of the change of priority from previous presidents. So I think we have to understand that. A second piece of it for me has to do with the economic crisis in which this country was engulfed in 2008 when President Obama took office. I come from a county in Maryland where the foreclosure rate went up 400%, where the unemployment rate was in double figures. Had President Obama focused initially on the international environment rather than the challenges at home, I think he would have been rightly blamed for not showing leadership on the domestic issues that were impacting this country. I think a third issue that we have to take into account in assessing the Obama legacy in Africa really has to do with the political environment in Washington, which, for lack of a better term, I would call dysfunctional. And it got only more rancorous over the years. So that's a backdrop. Could President Obama have done some things differently? Absolutely. There's no question about that in my mind. And I would take slight issue with Peter when he talks about the signature programs under President Obama. First of all, we see a continuation of US-Africa policy from Clinton to Bush to Obama. There has been tremendous continuity in terms of on the policy front. What we do see is a shift in priorities and programs.
When you say continuity, what's the common thread?
The common thread for me are the issues that anchor US policy in Africa: peace and security, trade, investment, and economic development, issues of democracy and governance.
Right.
Those have been consistent when you go back from Clinton to Bush to Obama. What you see is a difference in emphasis within that larger framework. And what President Obama did, and which I agree with with Peter, is that he expanded the framework of economic engagement between the US and Africa. We went from Africa being seen as an aid recipient to an Africa that could be seen as a potential partner. But more importantly, and I don't think he gets enough credit for this, the US had a negative budgetary situation when President Obama came into office.
Yeah.
What he did was develop private partnerships to fuel that engagement on the economic front. I think that's something we need to give him credit for.
Okay, Peter, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and I would agree with all that. And in fact, one of the things I think President Obama deserves credit for, and it builds on this continuity theme that Monday just spoke about, President Bush, I think, doesn't get enough credit. When under President George W. Bush, the amount of US assistance to Africa quadrupled.
Absolutely.
And in the very tough fiscal environment that President Obama inherited, where most regions of the world in the 8 years of the Obama presidency, aid was cut by roughly 20%. Africa, more or less, is an accounting error. It's been maintained at the Bush levels. That in itself is an achievement. I give him credit for that. Where I would take issue is follow through on certain aspects. For example, the president gave a great speech in Ghana during his first term that Christina referred to, talking about democracy. And yet over 8 years, assistance for democracy and governance programs in Africa were cut by 45%. How can you be serious about the importance of democracy when you gut the funding for democracy virtually in half? You know, there's a disconnect.
Let me get Christina's view on that. Christina,
I'd just like to offer my take, my perspective, if I can, just to build on your comments there, Peter. Yes, you know, Obama has this criticism against him that, you know, he didn't do more to help African countries. But on the one hand, he was also, you know, quite bound by domestic policy back home in the US. A lot of experts I've spoken to have said that, you know, even if he wanted to, he wouldn't have been able to have done more because he had this, he sought so hard to represent himself, to portray himself as a president of all Americans. He didn't want to play the ethnic card or be perceived as being the president of the third world or being too black. So I think in some respects that, you know, if there is disappointment, you know, it's perhaps, you know, not justified, but it's understandable because he had much expectations on him already back home. And given that the racial question in the US is so explosive, he couldn't really run the risk of you know, inflaming it even further, I think.
All right, Christina, let me be clear. I give him full credit for maintaining the level of aid. I don't think he could have increased the level of aid. There was no political will for that. But what I criticize him for is how he chose to spend the money that he did have. He maintained the Bush levels of funding. That's an achievement. Credit should be given to that. But if you're going to talk democracy and governance in Africa, and you cut the portion of money that you spend on it by almost 50%, there's a disconnect here, and we have to acknowledge that there's a disconnect.
Go ahead.
I would agree with Peter on that. If there's one criticism or critique of the engagement that I would have on a U.S. policy towards Africa, it would be precisely on the governance front.
Right.
That the governance landscape on the African continent is changing. And yet the way in which we engage on this question has not changed. And it needs to change if Africa is to continue realizing the positives, the transformation that it has embarked on over the years. But I would add that as much as I would have liked to see more resources, more signature programs, say in the democracy and governance space, the cut in democracy and governance funding actually started in the Bush administration. That it has just steadily increased over the years in terms of the magnitude of what we are losing for engagement in that space. And so one hopes that with the new administration, there's going to be a revisiting of this issue of what the African governance landscape looks like, political landscape, and how we could better engage in that sphere.
All right, there is one other criticism of President Obama's role in Africa, and that is the U.S. military role on the continent. I will get to that in a moment, but first we're going to have to take a break. More on U.S. President Barack Obama's legacy in Africa right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing U.S. President Obama's legacy in Africa as he nears the end of his term in office. Let's get back to our panel. Monday, let's pick up where we left off. There is something that President Obama left behind in Africa, and that is the number of military bases that the U.S. has. Well, let me not say bases. There's one big base in Djibouti, and these other things which are called cooperative staging locations, 60 of them. The Pentagon will tell us there's only one military base in Africa, but we know that there's 60 of them. In fact, the liberal site Tom's Dispatch reported that there are 60. Was the president more focused on security for the United States here and U.S. national security interests rather than other things in Africa?
Well, look, there's no doubt that security is the topmost priority for the United States. And we all know that the embassy attacks in Tanzania and in Kenya back in the 90s. We all know that subsequent attacks, Benghazi and the situation in the Horn of Africa, all of those have huge impact and implications for the larger global security, and that the U.S. is fundamentally interested in that as its #1 priority. So I think we should go in understanding that that's always going to be a priority for the United States. Now, we can question how the U.S. is engaging on the military front on the security issues. And whether there needs to be more of tying those programs, not just addressing the symptoms of the insecurity in Africa, but tying them into the sources and the causes of that insecurity in Africa. Right now, I think many people believe that there's been too much focus on addressing the symptoms rather than working in a comprehensive whole-of-government way to address the sources of insecurity. That's one criticism that I know has been labeled. Two, I know there's a lot of concern on the African continent that perhaps the United States is using too much of the terrorism lens to view insecurity in Africa, and that's problematic over the long term. So I think those are two key issues that the incoming administration, I think, would have to look at and say, how do we better address conflict and insecurity with Africa in Africa without necessarily viewing it mostly through that counterterrorism lens, because it does have implications for governance.
Christina, what's your view? Did Obama see Africa through the lens of U.S. national security more than anything else? And look, there are problems that the United States has in Africa. We know that ISIL has been active on the African continent, in Libya, in Somalia.
I saw Al-Shabaab.
Right, and Al-Shabaab staged attacks in Kenya. Boko Haram in West Africa has declared an alliance with ISIL. So the U.S. does have national security problems there, but was it perhaps too much of an emphasis on the part of this administration?
You know, I think when he visited Kenya last year, one of the main issues he discussed with President Uhuru Kenyatta was security. The U.S., of course, is quite instrumental and crucial in supporting Kenyan forces fighting Al-Shabaab in Somalia and the African Union-backed AMISOM force, and so there was, a feeling among Kenyans that perhaps there was too much emphasis placed on security and perhaps not enough on instilling and encouraging more efforts to promote democracy. Obviously, security is a huge concern, and after 9/11, of course, the terror threat remains a huge problem, coming from France, and which has been also a target these past few years. We can understand, why the U.S. would want to maintain, a high level of alert and ensure that there is no risk and no threat. But as I said earlier, democracy was his slogan almost. He talked about a new beginning, and that new beginning should have comprised also the democratic space and not just security. Security was George W. Bush's big signature slogan when he was in power. Barack Obama, when he came into office, was meant to go beyond that, and it seems as though he almost just repeated George W. Bush on that respect.
Okay, Peter, one can understand the U.S. acting in its own national security interests, whether it be here or in Africa or in any part of the world. But what about the security interests of African countries themselves? Boko Haram, very active in West Africa, in 3 countries in West Africa. The Nigerian ambassador complained in 2014, that the United States was not helping. The United States was not sharing intelligence, was not providing the weapons that they needed. They just didn't help.
Let me respond quickly to the point of the Nigerian ambassador, and God rest his soul. But that same ambassador, 2 years before that, was denying that Boko Haram was a terrorist threat. He took issue with me at a public forum when I made that assertion. So I think there's a little consistency in message there. But moving on Boko Haram, I was just in northeastern Nigeria. I was out in Maiduguri and then out in Borno State, and the Nigerian army is making noticeable progress, and part of it with assistance from allies, including the United States, the UK, and others. However, the challenge remains, and I think it's going to be something the new administration is going to inherit. Let me make 2 points on the security emphasis in the Obama administration. I think we're all agreed, it's understood. The U.S. has a security priority, and that's going to be the first, it should be the first priority. But I would say, my criticism of the Obama administration, its handling of security in Africa is not the security. That's natural. That's understandable. It's part of the job. But it proved to be largely short-sighted and somewhat transactional. And that had 2 consequences. One, very oftentimes, the bigger picture of threats deal with the threat of today, not look at the long-term. So, for example, during the first term, the conventional wisdom was Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, especially the faction led by Mokhtar al-Mokhtar, was no longer a threat. That was heavily discounted. Those of us analysts who said, watch out, something's coming, were largely ignored. And then we had Mali, the coup, and then the division of the country in 2012. The same thing with Boko Haram. Part of it was also messaging on the part of the Nigerians, but also the delays in recognizing that threat. The other, but I think more pernicious, of the short-sighted transactional, let's deal with it, a military solution, is it looks at the failure to look at security in a broader, holistic context. That long-term U.S. security interests, as well as that of African states, means investment not only in living, clearly there's a direct threat eliminated, but beyond that, building the structures, the institutions, the healthy institutions in society, the economic opportunities, the social opportunities that take the steam out of this. Otherwise, we're going to be back at this, dropping the hammer again and again and again. And perhaps part of it is, you can one can acknowledge realities, fiscal realities, political realities, but perhaps a little more strategic attention needed to be put. And I think that's certainly something that the new administration is going to have to look at and confront. And it's interesting that it's written in our laws. Every new administration coming in is required by U.S. law to prepare a national security strategy and hopefully confront some of these issues.
Monday, there was the African Leaders Summit here in Washington in 2014. Much was made of it. It was a big event. What did it achieve?
Oh, I think just the symbolism of it, that many African countries had been independent for over 50 years. This is the first time that African leaders were being invited to Washington as a group. I think the message that it sent was, here's a continent that deserves a seat at the international table, the adult table, if you will. So the symbolism and the power of that for me in terms of saying we need to look at Africa differently and not this big blob of inconvenience that has shaped our view of Africa for so many, that was powerful. And so, two, it was playing catch up. Other regions, the US had this sort of summit for years and years and years. But it's the first one for Africa. So there's the symbolism part of it. I think a second part of it for me has to be, now that the door has been opened, that needs to be institutionalized. It needs to be carried forward, otherwise it becomes just a meeting like any other meeting. And so how do we institutionalize that summit, give more meat and weight to it in terms of the issues that are discussed, the agreements that are signed at this summit? That's going to be the key for me. So I think we do need to give President Obama credit for that summit in terms of it really asked people to view Africa differently. It positioned Africa at the international table to where they have to carry on more responsibility themselves. And I think this is an issue that we also need to talk about. We can talk about how the United States has engaged Africa, but a corollary part of that for me is how African leaders are positioning themselves and their countries to earn that seat at the international table, to make sure that they understood that we are partners, full and equal partners, that the old colonial days are gone. So for me, it was powerful.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.